My name is Sultan Barakat, and I'm the Director of Research at the Brookings Doha Center. This evening's event is part of a series of events that we've been putting specifically on energy. Those of you who've been following our work at the Brookings, one important pillar of our research work is energy in the Gulf, but also globally. And usually we hold an international energy forum in Doha. And from this year onward, we've changed the strategy. Instead of having it annually, we'll have the energy forum every other year. And in between, we design a number of shorter events with more select audience, people who come who are interested in specific aspects of the energy research agenda. So this year, earlier, we had an event on the drop in the oil prices and its effects on Gulf states specifically. We had another event that looked at the LNG and the relationship between Qatar and the United States, and so on. Today's event is focused on the transit of oil and gas and the risks associated with that aspect of the energy agenda. It's something that has always been of concern to people in the region, but also to other consumers in Europe, in the United States, in India, China, and elsewhere. Partly because of the geography of the region and where the oil is being extracted from and the various choke points that it has to pass through, and partly because of the change in the political landscape around us. We live in a very uncertain times. Lots of phenomena are kind of playing simultaneously and affecting the degree of risk associated with the transit and the transport of oil and gas. For example, we have on the rise the issue of state fragility around the region. More and more territories are out of control of states, more in control of non-state actors. For example, what's going on in northern Kurdistan, northern Syria, and so on. Some of those territories are just transit areas. Some started to constitute hub areas for collection of some crude supplies. And of course, we continue to live under the shadow of a potential Iranian Gulf confrontation of some sort. And that is very much on the mind of a lot of policy makers all the time. We also have the issue of piracy that have risen and suddenly kind of disappeared. We're not quite sure that it has gone totally or not. And to add to the complication of all of this, we've had recently the drop in the oil prices, making the transport routes even more flexible to some suppliers and consumers. So now we hear about the possibility of some shipments taking a longer route, maybe around Africa, without much affecting the price of the oil they carry. So a lot of interesting things are happening at the same time. All are likely to affect the price and with it maybe the role that is played by our region within that broader context. To help us understand what is going on, we have published a paper. I don't know if most of you must have received it digitally, done by my colleague Robin Mills, which is entitled Risky Routes. And part of the purpose behind today's event is really to launch it in hard copy. So I hope you collected your complimentary copy of this very good paper, and it is in both English and Arabic on both sides. So the plan for today, we have about 90 minutes. The first 10 to 15 minutes I'm going to give to Robin to talk us through the paper itself and some of his main findings. And then we will engage in a question and answer for about half an hour or so between myself and the two speakers. And after that, I will open it for the audience to get your own input and questions. We have, usually we have our events, as you know, broadcast on Al Jazeera, but today, to allow slightly a more free, I don't know about free, but more relaxed atmosphere to talk about things that we may not want to share with Al Jazeera immediately. We are recording it, but this recording is only done by our center, and we will be broadcasting it on our website eventually. So the speakers and the audience should feel relatively free to express sensitive issues that are involved in this subject of security. Let me just start by giving a very brief background about our two guests tonight. Robin Mills, sitting on the far left, is a non-resident fellow for energy at the Brookings Doha Center. He has recently established Qamar Energy in 2015, which aims to meet the need for regionally based Middle East energy insights and investments. He's an expert on energy and has been around this region for quite a long time. He has been described by Foreign Policy as one of the energy world's great minds. And you'll see in a few minutes why that is the case. He has worked as a consultant with many groups, including Shell, and also worked for some major businesses and business development in the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Iraq, and so on. But he's really best known for being associated with us at the Brookings Doha Center. And we're very happy and honored to have him with us. And this is not the first study he's produced, and I hope it won't be the last in the coming year or so. He's a commentator in the news on a regular basis. He has a weekly column at the national newspaper in Abu Dhabi, but also comments frequently in various other outlets, including the BBC, Al Jazeera, Bloomberg, and others. Our second guest is Colonel Giuseppe Murabito, or as I would say in Arabic, Murabitoun, yes. We'll Arabize you. I think you must have some Arab blood in the name. Giuseppe is the director of the NATO Middle East faculty at the NATO Defense College. He previously commanded the Sergeant School of the Italian Army in Cassino in 2003 and participated in the Joint Forces operation in Bosnia-Herzegovina as Deputy Chief of Staff for operations between January and October 2004. Colonel Murabito spent most of his operational career in the Italian Light Infantry, serving as platoon commander and then as company commander. He then moved to the Italian Army General Staff College in Rome as staff officer in the International Training Branch, and between 1998 and 1999, he commanded the 17th Infantry Regiment, after which he served as the Chief of Staff in the Grantiere di
Very difficult. Grantieri.
Not too bad. He's now Chief of Staff of the NATO headquarters or was also the Chief of Staff of NATO's headquarters in Albania between 2000 and 2002. He has also collaborated quite widely with various universities in terms of research, and in fact we were very honored to have him here this time almost last year when we had a session on NATO's role in Afghanistan. He's with us here both representing NATO and or representing himself depending on the question. And
we will explain that. I can take out the pin. You decide, okay?
So depending on the question, he'll be representing himself or NATO. And as I said, this is not going to be broadcast live, and it's definitely not Al Jazeera camera. So with this introduction, I would like to invite Robin to start by giving us an overview of the risks that exist within the region in terms of oil and gas transit, and in particular if there is any particular distinction between oil and gas, and if some is more vulnerable than other. Robin.
Great. Thank you, Sultan. So thanks to everybody for coming out this evening. Now, we're approaching summer, and so I think it's great to have such a good turnout here as we get into a quieter period of the year. But of course, you know, for energy security and for security generally, summer in this region is often not a quiet period, and some of the most dramatic and dangerous events in this region have taken place in summer. And that, I think for me, establishes a kind of paradox that we have in the oil and gas markets today, in that we're in a period of very unusually low prices for oil and for gas. And you know, we know the challenges that this is bringing for the region, but we're also in a period at which there are pretty much unprecedented threats to energy security in a number of places around the world, but particularly in the Middle East and North Africa region. And this is, we're at a time when OPEC's spare capacity is at really pretty much at record low levels. We're in a period at which there is a very high level of supply disruption, particularly in oil, not so much in gas, but very much in oil. There is a globally high level of disruption. Some of that is in areas outside the region, such as Nigeria and Venezuela and so on, but a lot of that disruption is within the Middle East, North Africa region. And yet the oil markets and the gas markets are relatively relaxed about this. There are certain features of the market, I think, which make the market relaxed, and maybe the market is right to be relaxed for now. But we can see these are long-running threats, and some of the threats in this region are threats that already have persisted for several years and may persist for many years yet. And so although we may be in a period of oversupply in the oil market today, we may be in a period of abundant supplies, we may have very high stocks globally. So indeed, maybe there isn't a huge threat to the market immediately from these disruptions, but we can easily imagine that the market could tighten significantly over the next few years, and so that making the market much more vulnerable. And there are some threats in the oil and particularly in the gas supply picture, which are not very easy to mitigate. And we'll talk later, I think, as we get on to discuss this topic about mitigation, about some of the options that we can use to tackle energy security threats. But I think it's fair to say there are some threats, even within the current oil market, which would be very significant, which would have a very severe effect on global oil supplies, on customers, on, of course, oil exporters themselves, and on the global oil market. So let's think about some of these threats, and one thing I tried to do in the paper was to provide something kind of hierarchy of threats to oil and gas security. And I mentioned we're at a time of unusually high risks in this region. And some of these risks have actually turned into real threats and real disruptions of oil and gas supplies. And Sultan mentioned the issues of state breakdown, the role of non-state actors, sometimes violent and extremist non-state actors, sometimes separatist state actors trying to take control of natural resources for their own benefit, or possibly blocking the transit of natural resources. And this gives rise to threats, I think, at all levels. You have at the very local level, right up to major interstate conflicts. So at the very local level, you have acts of sabotage, you have communities who are maybe demanding a greater share of natural resources in their area, and who will block a pipeline or block an export terminal. You have acts of piracy, of course, which we've seen in recent years off Somalia in particular, and perhaps that could happen elsewhere. Somewhat above that, you have more long-lived and more widespread campaigns waged by armed extremist groups, and we're obviously getting pretty familiar with that. Sadly familiar with that in Western Iraq and in Syria, and also in Libya and in Yemen. So some major hotspots in the region, and some of these areas. Libya, of course, is a very important oil producer, or certainly was prior to its revolution, and could be again. Iraq, of course, is a very important oil producer, although the current violence is largely away from oil-producing areas. Syria and Yemen were less important oil producers, but they were still oil producers and exporters.
Yemen was and also quite an important liquefied natural gas exporter, which has been entirely halted by the war and instability in Yemen. So you have a kind of a regional scale or even at a national scale, you have breakdowns of security which make it impossible to continue oil and gas production or impossible to continue oil and gas transit. And then you have the very large and very extreme scale, which thankfully we haven't seen yet, and hopefully we won't see, but there is always, of course, the possibility of a major interstate conflict involving two or more states, and possibly also then drawing in actors from outside the region. And this is, again, it's not a unique occurrence to the region. There have been a number of interstate wars over the past decades here. A couple of them which have had very significant impacts on energy security. The 1973 war between Israel and Egypt and Syria, of course, didn't affect oil and gas supplies really directly, but it did lead to the embargo by Arab nations on oil supplies to the US, and that triggered the first oil crisis and a very major rise in oil prices around the world, and a series of geopolitical consequences which have unfolded from then on. And then the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s, which definitely did, of course, involve two major oil and gas suppliers, and in which there was severe damage to the oil production or facilities of both. And there was a significant phase in that war, the tanker war, in which there were a large number of direct attacks on oil and gas installations in the Gulf and on tankers, on shipping, that eventually led to the intervention of the US and the USSR to protect shipping through the Gulf. And this is probably one of the classic cases that people think about when they think about energy security in this region. There's always this fear that the Strait of Hormuz or the Gulf will be closed to shipping, and this would prevent oil and gas exports entirely. And this is one of this kind of broader class of choke points which people like to address, points which control oil and gas transit around the world. So Hormuz is clearly the most important one. Hormuz carries typically about 17 million barrels per day of oil exports. So that's out of about 92 million barrels per day of oil production worldwide. So you can see we're talking about 20% plus of global oil supplies and something like a third of globally traded oil. So obviously the loss of that supply would be catastrophic for the world economy. Also, which you don't hear addressed so much about Hormuz, but it's also the sole route for the export of LNG from Qatar.
Liquefied natural gas, which is an absolutely essential source of energy for East Asia, for Japan, Korea, Taiwan in particular, but also important for Europe and for other LNG importers. And there's also LNG exports from Abu Dhabi, not as much, but also adding to that as well. And they have to use Hormuz. So for the oil supplies, and we'll talk about this a bit later, the oil supplies out of Hormuz, there are some bypassing routes, there are some ways that you can avoid Hormuz to an extent, but for liquefied natural gas there is no way around. And the loss of that would be catastrophic for economies that are dependent on it. There are other choke points in this region, Bab el-Mandeb, the southern entrance to the Red Sea, and the Suez Canal, of course, at the northern end. Also very important routes for trade in general, but indeed also for oil and gas supply. Less so to an extent, and less so now that Europe is not importing as much Middle Eastern oil in particular as it used to, but still important. And then the Bosphorus Straits in Turkey providing the entrance or exit from the Black Sea, which is an important route for Russian oil and Caspian oil in particular coming out of the Black Sea. Now you may think that Turkey is a stable country, that Bosphorus is less under threat. Probably true, but it is another point of concern. And then you have broader transit routes, which are maybe not focused on single choke points, but nevertheless are vulnerable to interdiction. For example, the routes supplying oil and gas pipelines from Azerbaijan through Georgia into Turkey. You have gas pipelines to be constructed through southern Pakistan, Balochistan, which is an area which has seen long-running insurgencies. And you have a number of other major oil and gas pipelines, Sinai, which has seen in Egypt, which has seen repeated attacks on gas exports from Egypt, which have now ceased entirely, not just because of sabotage, but that certainly hasn't helped. So there are other routes, other pipeline routes, which can be maybe replaced in the longer term, but can't easily be replaced in the short term. So when we think about these risks, you have this real contrast of things that can be done in the long term, and you might be fairly relaxed about Hormuz, say, in the long term, and you can say, well, you can build pipelines to bypass it, but any blockade in the short term, and short term can be anything from months up to 1-2 years, there's very little that can be done in terms of finding any alternative route. And finally, I think when we think about the issue of state breakdown and the loss of state capacity in the region, there's a broader and more diffuse, more subtle threat to energy security, which is really to do with investment. In an area, a country with kind of a moderate level of insecurity or violence, you will see, I think, the international oil and gas industry can still operate at a somewhat higher cost. We'll find ways to deal with this insecurity. The oil industry has operated in Nigeria under quite difficult conditions for many years. Oil companies operate in southern Iraq and with heavy security, but they found a way to operate acceptably. But at some point, insecurity becomes so severe that it severely deters investment or perhaps prevents it entirely. And so in the longer term, this is a threat to developing promising new sources of oil and gas around the world, and including this region in particular. And you can imagine, of course, that even with some improvement in security, it'll be very hard for international energy companies to go back into Libya, for example, and to begin operations immediately. Pipeline routes across Afghanistan have been discussed for a long time. I mean, again, insecurity is a threat to those. So there's this longer-term impact of deterring investment, making investment more difficult, and restricting the investment to only a smaller group of companies. So that was my view on the energy security, some of the key energy security threats. Of course, you can then drill down in a military sense and a more detailed security sense, as I hope the Colonel will be able to, on what exactly would the military response be and how serious are these threats? Would there be an easy security response to them or not? And that's outside my field of expertise. But I've tried to highlight some of the key issues, some of the key vulnerabilities. And I think as we go on with this discussion later on, we'll then also be able to talk about some of the possible solutions to these problems.
Great, thank you so much. We've always been hearing about the Hormuz vulnerability as a strait. But has there actually been an incident when the supplies were stopped or interrupted ever?
Well, this is a very, I think a really key point. A lot of analysis of energy security in the region focuses on Hormuz because it looks on the map like such a narrow little waterway, and yet it obviously carries so much oil and gas, so it looks very vulnerable. Now, in terms of real blockades, I mean, it's not like the Suez Canal, obviously. It's 50-odd miles wide, so it's not something that you can block physically by sinking a tanker in it or something. Obviously, it could be blocked by mines, by missile attacks, and so on, or at least it could be made so difficult to get through it that commercial ship owners wouldn't be willing to take the risk. Now, we've never seen a complete blockade of Hormuz. Not to say that it couldn't happen, and of course, certain regional neighbours repeatedly make threats to block Hormuz, which they never carry out, or haven't done yet. But if you look at the Iran-Iraq war, of course, there was not a blockade of Hormuz, but there were literally hundreds of attacks on shipping, and significant numbers of ships, including tankers, were sunk or put out of action. Now, shipping through the Gulf continued, at a lower level, but of course, you could say, well, that was fine. I mean, oil and gas trade continued, but at a very high cost, and there was significant military involvement, as I said, from the USA and the USSR. There was obviously huge losses in terms of destruction of ships and loss of life. So, although that wasn't catastrophic for the world economy, it was certainly not an outcome that we want to repeat.
Sure. Thank you so much. Giuseppe, from a hard security point of view, I assume that NATO does its own analysis about the security of the routes, particularly with many NATO member countries being dependent on supplies from this part of the world. Could you just share with us that security perspective, and what would it take for NATO to intervene in the region to secure certain routes?
Okay. First of all, thanks for coming, for inviting me. And sorry for my English, I'm not mother tongue. I have a terrible Italian Roma slang, so sorry for that. Try to keep you awake. NATO is interested because all the 28 nations are interested in their future. All the citizens of the 28 nations have to live in their future. So they are very interested in the future. And the energy supply is the future of this region and the future of the economy of the 28 nations. Plus, we can consider 2 or 3 out of this business. So when I'm speaking on your future and my future as Italian, because you and me, we have to live the rest of our life in our future. And the future of this area is the freedom of movement of gas and oil. If without this freedom, the future will be very bad. We can agree on that at least. The 28 nations. What is important to say, NATO has not the Gulf as its interest area. But we are interested in what is happening here because it's out of interest for us. Because if the supply of gas is stopped, there is a problem in the economy of all the NATO nations. But we can consider only out of this business Norway, because they have UK, because of shale gas. All the other nations have a problem. And if we consider a stop of support, of energy support from this area, it's very difficult to think in the future that the NATO nation knock the door of Mr. Putin asking to have more gas from him or more oil from him. It's very difficult. All is possible, but it's very difficult. So from this point of view, you know better than me, the history of NATO is run by events. The events change the history of NATO. Something happened, and then they change the policy, the political leaders join, change the policy, and take decision. But are the events that change the history of NATO? Are the events that change our future, where we have to live? So, coming back to energy, it's very important that in the near future, the movement of gas and oil keep to be free and to reach the area of consume. There are the Mediterranean Sea, the north of Europe. Today, sorry for that, but I have to come. Today, the first things that I arrived from Rome, marvelous weather, a little bit hot here for me. I jump in the car, terrible air conditioner, I don't use air conditioner, I read this newspaper. Have you seen this newspaper this morning? Okay, this article. What does it mean, this article? That the cost of the gas for Qatar don't change. Do you agree? I'm not the editor of this newspaper. I don't take one penny from, penny is correct in English, no? I don't take one penny from him. So what is the point? If the cost of the gas don't rise, most probably more ships will go around Africa. Why? Because he is happy because he's Brits. Lloyd's is Brits. So for sure he say you're no risk. But imagine that you close Hormuz, or there is a problem in Suez. The one that is very happy is the president of Lloyd's, because immediately the cost of the insurance for the ships rise. Silence. Never considered that. The Brits are very happy. Only Mr. Lloyd's, not all of them. And this is very important to know. Is very happy Mr. Putin. Don't forget that NATO is divided in two. There are two souls on NATO. I belong to the one that believe that is most important, the south flank. But there are some nations that have a nightmare. The nightmare of the Russian. no European citizen was killed from the Russian in the last 5 years. Or no NATO citizen was killed from. Probably some more of them were killed from people coming from the south flank. Just a little bit difference. Anyway, there are some nations that are very nervous because of Putin. But Putin has a terrible hybrid. I don't know if you know, if you have heard of hybrid war. Have you heard of this word in the past? The tool of gas is very important. The gas from Russia has no cost. Russia, unbelievable to say, is a stable country. I don't see in the future, next 5 years, any problem or revolution or any attack in Russia. The government will be stable. Probably in the south of the Mediterranean Sea, the situation is not the same. I was speaking with Robin before. 1/3 of the cost, in 1/3 of the cost of Mediterranean, when you land with your ship, you can reach a mosque in a few minutes. Oh, no, half, 50%. In 1/3, if you land, you speak Arabic. Consider this. But these are also the more unstable areas of the south of the Mediterranean. But the flow, the movement of energy has to pass from them. If there is a problem, there is only one way, go around Africa, and this is a big problem because the cost of the gas for my friend in Qatar will never rise. No? Or more, we have to reduce again to allow to be in the market because the shale gas exists and the Russian exists. So coming back to NATO. NATO, in this moment, if nothing happens, has a very low interest in the security of energy. Because there are other problems. There are two names. Daesh, as you look, my pronunciation is correct? Daesh, correct.
It depends on you.
It depends. It's my Roman slang. And Putin. If you ask them to head security of energy, it's very difficult. In a few weeks, there will be in Warsaw a summit of NATO. I don't think that they will spend more than 5 minutes in the day of discussion speaking of security of energy. This is the reality. The reality. Because in some way, the energy is arriving. And I remember what I told you at the beginning, events. If events happen, probably they will consider the problem.
But let me take you to task on the events business, because in the old days, when there used to be a war in Lebanon, the oil price will go up. Now we have a war that involves Saudi Arabia, the largest producer, that controls the price, etc., and Yemen, who also is a producer of oil and gas, and it doesn't seem to affect the market.
Because there is I have an answer. Only one word: shale. Shale gas. In the near future, the United States of America will be the first producer of gas in the world.
But it hasn't driven NATO to react in any way.
No, because we are not, again,
it's not affected the supply.
We are not affected.
Yeah.
We are not affected. And don't forget that NATO is half of the budget of NATO comes from the States. So this is also important to consider. In any case, I don't want to say this. In this moment, it's not a threat. Imagine, look, during the war of the operations, let's go in this way, the operation in Libya, there was a complete stoppage of the movement of gas and oil from Libya, but was compensated. Okay, now I can tell you a joke because I need that you smile a little bit. The Italians eat pasta, but to cook pasta, all the Italian ladies use gas. Gas. We don't have electricity in Italy, we use gas. So, Sicily, I don't know if you know my country, Sicily to Florence, but it's not a beautiful, bad city, we use the gas from Algeria. Border with Germany to Florence, we use the gas from Russia. So there is a way, but we have gas in any case, but the pipelines are interconnected. So when if we have any problem with Russia, probably Algeria can send more gas to us. And the same is happening in Spain. So all the European nations have a plan. 7 times or 8 times per year, a big ship from Qatar arrives in Italy, and they give gas to us to cook our pasta. But this is important. You smile, but it's important. Imagine that I had to tell the Italian lady, no pasta today, no pizza. No, to keep her tension rise, you know. And it's the same. If you go in Germany, you don't have electricity to produce beer. I don't speak of food with UK because it's not the case, but doesn't matter. But okay. But this is important that you know. I like that you smile because the concepts stay in your mind. The level of the life in our country is more important than all the other problems. There is a nightmare to have to reduce our level of life in the NATO countries, European countries. And if gas become a nightmare, they will act. If gas is not a problem, or remain calm because the price is stable, it's okay. And now the shale gas, and we started at the NATO Defense College to discuss for shale gas in 2012. With the first meeting, the shale gas is a leverage that the Americans have to keep the price low, for sure. But this is not NATO business, it's personal thinking.
Thank you. And I mean, it's interesting the point you make about infrastructure and how you can use it to reduce risk or mitigate risk a little bit, so that if you have less supplies from one part of the world, somewhere else can pump its gas into that. Now, that is a mechanism available for consumers. But for suppliers, and you in your earlier presentation, Robin, raised the point that Qatar, for example, is 100% dependent, now that it is doing LNG only, on Hormuz. So there's only one route. What are other strategies to mitigate risk? I mean, aside from infrastructure, physical routes are fine. What else do states put into place to try and reduce the risk of disturbance?
Yeah, I think this is a very important point, and I try to express in the paper the kind of 3 big areas of techniques that people have used to reduce these vulnerabilities. And I think the Colonel's point about Europe and the interconnections is a great one. European gas interconnections have improved a lot over the past few years and made particularly Eastern Europe a lot less vulnerable to say, any interruption of supplies from Russia. And when I think about the old Italian lady cooking the pasta, that's one problem. But a few years ago we had Bulgaria, which is 100% dependent on Russian gas, and other Eastern European countries having no gas in the middle of winter. And then it's not about pasta, but it's about the house freezing, and it's about human life. So that risk has been greatly reduced. But that was done within the framework of an institution, the European Union, which realized that this is a real critical vulnerability, and took a lot of actions and made money available to create interconnections and reduce that vulnerability. So, when you think about oil and gas exports from the region, how they're threatened, people will focus on infrastructure, new infrastructure, and that's important. So things like pipelines that bypass Hormuz and that give alternative export routes, and strategic storage of to some extent of gas, but particularly strategic storage of oil, which could be held in the region, or it could be held by the consuming country. And of course, consuming countries if you take Europe, the US, China now, they do hold a lot of oil in storage as well to protect against these kind of disruptions. So, that infrastructure is an important part, but that only goes so far. And I think one of the points I try to make is that infrastructure has to be in the middle of an institution, and it's much more effective when it is. So, for example, if you have a disruption of Hormuz, Saudi Arabia has a bypass pipeline which goes to the Red Sea. Saudi Arabia could send most of its oil exports through that to the Red Sea, and its exports would only be reduced by a couple of million barrels per day. And the Saudis would probably far more gain on the increase in price than they would lose on having their exports reduced a bit. But of course, this outcome would be catastrophic for oil importers, but also for these oil exporters who depend on Hormuz entirely, which is really Kuwait and Qatar particularly, and also to a large extent Iraq as well, and also Iran. All of these countries have almost no other way of getting their oil out. The UAE via Abu Dhabi has created a pipeline which goes from Abu Dhabi through across to the Indian Ocean coast. So the UAE is now not dependent on Hormuz. So that's a piece of infrastructure which gives the UAE security. Now, but if you think about it from, a Saudi point of view, the Saudis could think, well, if Hormuz is interrupted, well, we know the price will go up, we will gain, we'll lose a bit of exports, but that's fine, that will be more than replaced by increased price. And then, if Kuwait is suffering, well, that's just too bad. But of course, Saudi Arabia sits within the GCC, and from a GCC point of view, this would be disastrous. So for the GCC, for example, to work together on infrastructure gives it a gain to all that members' security. And when you think about the use of that kind of infrastructure, it's also, I think, a way of protecting yourself. Even if Hormuz is never blocked, just the fact of having that spare infrastructure gives you the confidence that if anybody threatens you, it's an empty threat because you have alternatives. And from an investor's or an outside customer's point of view, again, they have confidence in you because they know if there's an interruption to one supply route, there are other supply routes that can be used instead. So that gives a much broader benefit than simply just constructing a piece of metal on the ground. And this is very important also when you think about consuming nations. And again, we've seen this in the past. When there is an interruption, everybody scrambles for supplies that are in short supply. Countries will put on export bans, and they'll say any oil we're importing can't be exported again. And then, of course, countries end up going short because everybody is competing for these limited supplies. Whereas if you have clear rules and procedures and organisations that will say, well, if there is a disruption, here's the set of rules we're going to follow, we will have a way of allocating the scarce supplies amongst everybody who needs it, then you don't get that panic, and the impact of any disruption is much less. And you'll often see if there are oil crises or shortages, the real damage is done by the panic, not by the shortage itself. That's certainly what we saw in the 70s. Now, the International Energy Agency is one very important body for this, and that was set up in the 70s following the first oil crisis to amongst other things, to coordinate this kind of emergency response. But the IEA, although it's been in many ways very successful, doesn't include now the big consuming nations, the new emerging markets. It doesn't include India, doesn't include China particularly. And it also doesn't include the producing countries, so it doesn't include Middle East producers, it doesn't include Russia, doesn't include Brazil. So the IEA is kind of limited. And what I was trying to do in the paper, I don't really have an answer to this, but I was trying to explore what kind of institutions are there. Should this energy security aspect be taken up by the GCC? Yeah, it probably should. But of course, the GCC is only part of the Middle East, and there are other important Middle East producers. Should it be taken up by OPEC? OPEC probably has a role, but OPEC, of course, includes other countries like Nigeria and Venezuela, whose concerns are very different from those in the Middle East. Should it be done just by interagency cooperation between, say, GCC or OPEC and the IEA? I mean, there is a forum between the IEA and OPEC. But I think whatever it is, I mean, there's clearly a need for some kind of better coordination on these issues. And then the issue of markets. Again, I think when there's a crisis, there's a temptation for governments to try and step in and control the market. Yes, there clearly is a role for government in calming panics and obviously very much a role for governments on the security side. But again, you've seen a lot of the damage in energy supply shortages has been done when the market wasn't allowed to work, when there were price caps, when there was rationing, and that's often done more damage. So having markets that will function effectively and be a bit resilient under stress is very important. And part of this is good information. So the quality of oil and gas information has improved a lot over the past few years, but it's still quite a long way short of what we need. We don't have a very good picture on strategic stocks in China, for example, or even on real Chinese demand. We don't necessarily have a very good picture on true producing capacity in some major OPEC countries. So better data, again, gives the market the confidence that it can cope with the supply shock. Or if the market can't cope, at least we know that in advance and can do something about it. So really, these are sets of techniques I think all have to be used together. So infrastructure, pipelines, storage has to be built by institutions and has to have clear rules how it's going to be used. And a single country can build infrastructure on its own, but really, generally, the big benefit of infrastructure comes when it's multinational. And for example, if you're Kuwait and you want to avoid Hormuz, well, within Kuwaiti territory, there's no way to do that. You have to be working together with neighbours. Qatar's in a similar position to that as well. So, and that means, you need some kind of regional cooperation to allow that to happen. So this is some of the issues that we face when we think mitigation. I think you've also got to say some risks can't be mitigated or can't really be mitigated at an acceptable cost. The infrastructure required will be too expensive or is not practical. The market has to accept that and deal with it in other ways by diversifying supplies, by insurance, by whatever other techniques are available. So it's important, again, to do a cost-benefit analysis of all of these different possible methods and see which one seems most attractive.
It's amazing, actually, to think that even when the prices were so high, there hasn't been that level of investment in creating an alternative route for export in this region. And from what you say, it sounds like there is no common agenda, Gulf agenda, to look into the risk and then try and work around it, which is, I find it surprising. It's not my area, but given their total dependence on oil and gas and the income that's generated from it, you think that this has already been thought through and implemented. Particularly that in some cases, like in the case of Yemen, if you have an alternative pipeline that goes through Yemen straight to the sea, it will also be an uplift to the development of Yemen. It will provide additional resources, create jobs, etc., etc. So it could be both reducing risk, but also investing more in development. And it seems to be very short-sighted that we're not doing all this, and we're just relying on providing hard security or the threat of hard security by inviting friends to come and take bases in the region to try and stabilize it. But I want to move on to the issue of diplomacy. To what extent do you think diplomacy can play a role in this? And I'm now looking at trying to reflect on the way Qatar conducts its own affairs. I mean, maybe now I'm thinking, given being so reliant on one access point or exit point, they have no alternative but to follow a balanced relationship with Iran, to try and have a softer line than other neighbors towards Iran and so on. Is diplomacy an important component of this? Do people sit and talk about this, states, to try and reduce the risk, maybe behind closed doors?
Well, I think the diplomacy is very important. I mean, we have a number of severe regional conflicts, as we know, right? Of which the Syria-Iraq conflict, Yemen, Libya, the most serious, and they all affect energy security. Now, solving those conflicts, I think, would be a great thing for many, many reasons. Energy security is not the most important reason for trying to bring those conflicts to an end, but it is an important one. So, yes, I think there is a role for diplomacy in supporting energy security in that sense. I mean, on the GCC, I think the GCC is kind of a natural forum for this. I mean, the GCC together couldn't solve all of the Middle East energy security problems. but they could certainly make themselves much more resilient. And there have been some discussions. I mean, Oman, of course, being on the Indian Ocean is a useful way out, and the Omanis have had discussions with, I certainly know with the Kuwaitis over this. But I mean, you'd need at least also the Saudis to be part of that as well, just by the realities of geography. So there have been discussions, but not led to anything really tangible yet. But I think this question, when you think about Qatar's position, then it's often been said, and of course Qatar, its greatest asset, the North Field, the gas field, which is shared with Iran, of course, goes into Iranian waters. It's often been said that the fact that both countries are developing that to, I mean, not cooperatively, kind of competitively, but they share the same resource, obviously means the Qataris have to be careful in how they deal with Tehran. I mean, I think that's well understood. That's perhaps one of the most obvious examples of that dynamic. I think the other ones in the region are a bit more subtle. But no, I think energy security probably doesn't get the attention it deserves, and I think, as the Colonel addressed earlier, in NATO meetings, if 5 minutes are devoted to energy security, that's already a lot. And that's probably often true in this region. I mean, unless you're talking about a specific threat, a specific bombing of a pipeline or some real incident, but as energy security as a concept, no, I don't think it gets enough attention.
Interesting. If I may go on this point, it's very important. You are right. I want to ask you to focus what he said. 5 minutes. Because remember the events. NATO has advantage. It's an arena of discussion. 28 countries, a lot of cooperation with ICI country, with Mediterranean dialogue country. So at least for this issue, let's call it problem. For this problem, it's possible to think that the nation that are affected from the problem ask NATO to be an arena, an area where we can discuss because of the cooperation. It's very important. When you tell, probably we discussed before to come about one idea. It's my personal idea, so this is absolutely Giuseppe's idea, personal idea. Coming back what you said, that Kuwait and Qatar are the two countries more affected from Hormuz. And one idea should be that Qatar organize here a center of excellency of the area on the traffic control, of the sea traffic control. So why not Qatar having the idea to be the nation that organize a center of study, of school, where all the people in the area start to discuss the traffic control, all the threat in the area. In the NATO, and I was taking this, sorry if I look at my paper, but the name is terrible of this organization. In the NATO, there is a center of excellence. The name is NATO Maritime Interdiction Operational Training Center. It's in Greece. Imagine to have in Qatar, at Doha, a ICI Maritime Interdiction Operational Training Center, where all the nation and hub for the security of the Gulf from all the countries of the area. And who has to be the main actor? The two nations that, as you told us, had more problems. This is an idea. So when you have an area, a forum, a college, a building where you can discuss it, have a common training, make exercise how to react to the problem, probably you give the famous word, a sort of deterrence to the other to create a problem. If you do something showing that you are ready to react, that you have a plan where you study the problem, I not want to sell the product because I'm infantry, I'm not there yet, so this is very important. But when you have a product, you create what is in the NATO was working for years, deterrence. Don't do anything against us because we are ready to react. Infrastructure are very important because if you build a system that cannot be affected from the first attack, because we have to be honest, this is my work scenario. If one nation or one alliance create a problem in Hormuz, not create a problem in Hormuz and that's it. Probably is a combination of action to create a problem in the economy of the other side of the Gulf. Don't think, hey, we come back on the ground. If I block Hormuz, it's only the first action of a maneuver. It's not only a fact per se, as we say in Latin. It's a first step of something that will happen. So deterrence is very important. Showing that you are ready to solve the problem is very important. Showing that you have a backup plan is very important. And we are in the right nation, because for geographical position, for budget capacity, can create this. It's a personal opinion. NATO is creating a lot of center of excellence in the area, showing the potential enemy or potential adversaries that they are able to solve the problems. We have a cyber attack, we have a cyber center where we study how to solve the problem against cyber attack. Now we have a team of people that move in the nation that has a cyber attack, moving from this center. We have a maritime center. If something happens, these people in Greece have created know-how. So why not here? And don't tell me that you have budget problem. Probably the Greek have more budget problem than Qatar or Kuwait. Sorry for the Greeks, but it's real. This is just when you told me you speak of diplomacy. Diplomacy is important, but some very strong action are very important.
Thank you. Let me ask about Iran. Robin, Iran, as they're coming back into the market, are they still investing in the vulnerable Hormuz area, or are they now looking to export oil from elsewhere? And the new investment, is it being diverted elsewhere, or they're doing the same thing as us?
Well, this is always pretty interesting, I think, with Iran, because when you talk about closing Hormuz, of course, everybody thinks of Iran, and there's been often, right from back from the 80s onwards, threats by various Iranian military people and politicians to close Hormuz, which they've never actually done or never really tried to do, except maybe during the Iran-Iraq war. But Iran is totally dependent on the Gulf for oil exports, and also for its petrochemicals, and also for most of its imports. It's only and its ports, also its deep water ports, are all on the are all in the Gulf as well. So in importing a lot of necessities, it's completely reliant on the Gulf. Now it's tried to develop ports, particularly Chabahar, which is on the Indian Ocean coast, kind of adjacent to Pakistan, but that's not an oil exporting port, and it's very remote from any other real population centers in Iran. As far as oil is concerned, Iran has talked for a long time about developing Jask, which is kind of just outside Hormuz, as an oil export port and linking it with the pipeline. Maybe exporting Caspian oil through there as well, through a pipeline from the Caspian region. Still, nothing really done on that yet. Of course, sanctions and so on have delayed any plans like this. But Iran is actually, just as vulnerable as Kuwait or Qatar to using the Gulf. And it's more vulnerable than the UAE or Saudi Arabia, which is it's kind of strange. And I think this is one of the reasons why, if there ever was a big conflict, Iran would only attempt to close down Hormuz really as a last resort.
So really, it's in everyone's interest to keep the Gulf secure.
Indeed, I think.
So why don't we have a common security agenda that brings all Gulf inhabitants, like similar to what Giuseppe was saying about the Mediterranean and the center in Greece? It's just not going to happen because of politics. Which let me elaborate on this, because at the moment we have less and less channels of communications, and we're even blocking what exists or what existed, and we're pushing other nations like Oman and even Qatar to sort of have less and less and less. So if there were to happen an incident, it could easily spiral into something much bigger because we don't even communicate.
Sure. Yeah, sure. I think it's a problem, and obviously if there was a regional cooperation body, that would be great. But in the current political situation, I think there's a lot of suspicion on both sides, and probably not much of a move towards that. I guess you could also say it's a bit difficult, right? Because there isn't an external threat. It's not like maybe if you take the South China Sea, is a bit different, right? I mean, you've got the various states around the South China Sea that are concerned about the role of China, but in the Gulf, the states in the Gulf are not concerned that the US is going to try and shut down the Gulf, right? I mean, quite the opposite. So the dynamic here is, you have the two opposing sides, and they're the mutual threats. I mean, obviously, I think if there was better regional security cooperation, that'd be great. But
it's not going to happen.
You're the expert, but on that. But I don't see it for now.
But let's then move to NATO and one of your very important members, Turkey, and its role in all this oil transit and gas. What's you doing?
Okay. Ask me a question. Ask me a question.
Well, just help us understand the role Turkey is playing at the moment as a hub and transit. They're trying to. They're important for Russia. They're important for northern Iraq, Kurdistan. There are lots of stories in the newspapers about potentially dark deals going on and so on.
Okay.
And how is it seen from within NATO, and what would you do about it?
Okay, let's say, if you ask me as NATO member or a representative of NATO, Turkey is one of our members. It's a democratic country. Look, I said underline democratic country, and stable, and no problem. Okay.
Okay. Now I ask you as you said.
Okay. Look at the newspaper of 3 weeks ago. Putin declared that at the moment of a peace in Syria, they had to call at the table, around the table, the Kurdish people that live in the north of Syria.
Yes.
And he can explain to you, because morphologically, the pipeline that leave the Silk Route and go to the Mediterranean are affected in some way from the Kurdish people. They are in Iraq or in Syria or in the east of Turkey. The pipeline had to transit there.
Okay.
So, if Turkey don't find the way to find an agreement with the Kurdish of the so-called, now I speak of something that exists but doesn't exist, Kurdistan. Kurdistan is in 4 countries: Iraq, Iran, Turkey, and Syria. They speak the same language. They write in the same way. They pray with the same frequency. So this means something, So, and the transit of the gas, of oil, transit from the Kurdistan. Call as it, if there is a diplomat from Turkey now stand up, say, Giuseppe, Kurdistan doesn't exist. But there is a reality. So this is very important. The hub of NATO, the hub of the gas is there. Or we have to pass through Suez or go around Africa. There is no other way. This is morphological, if you look at the map. This is the reality. And consider that also the nation has a lot of conflictuality. 62% of the bargain on NATO are because of Turkey. Consider. This is not my theory, it was said from the president of the Marshall NATO Marshall Center, so more important than me. So there are problems, there are real problems in the area. Now the government is stable, but what will happen? Today is Tuesday. Last Wednesday, the President of the Republic of Turkey decided that the parliamentarian of Turkey have no anymore the protection in their action because they are parliamentarian. So we have to read some also the information in the 5th page of a newspaper, you know? What does it mean? That he wants to put all the members of parliament of the Kurdish party in prison? What will happen in the area? And look, the pipeline, look, take the map of Turkey and look where the pipeline passed through. And okay, who will assure the security of the pipeline? And this is very important because, again, get back to NATO. NATO can help the nation, the transit nation, to secure the transit line. NATO can instruct the forces of a nation, the transit nation, how to train their military guys to protect the line of communication. But it's a NATO nation, you cannot instruct them.
But now that we're speaking openly, are there any under-the-table deals between NATO or its NATO nations and the Kurdish to protect the pipeline?
There is a man in Washington.
Right.
But I cannot quote the name, no?
I don't know the man.
No, okay. Yeah. That create the Kurdish state. What is in the north of Syria now? No? Was created because this nation in the north on the other side of the Atlantic decided to support the policy and to have this party that was opposing the only people that put the boots on the ground against Daesh.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know if you ever had the meeting with, or we ever had a visit these people. These people will prefer to be killed one by one, male and female, before to give back the territory. So for sure, there is an agreement. The Italian forces, I speak of my nation, so nobody can quote me, are training the Kurdish Peshmerga today. Today, in this moment. So there is a way if you train them, if you give a know-how to control the territory.
This is very interesting. Let me just move on to another part of the world. Algeria. You earlier said Italy and to some extent maybe France are reliant on Algerian gas. And Algeria so far has been stable. What is it you're doing to ensure its continued stability? Or are you waiting for it to collapse and then you react?
You have to ask my friend Morabitoum, no?
Yeah.
The Morabitoum, probably you know, some of you knows the Morabitoum are one of the main clans living on the mountain between Libya and Algeria, you know? And when my cousins decide to defeat Gaddafi, they came down from the mountain and they changed the story of the life of Gaddafi. Anyway, now be serious. For sure, the line of communication from the south or the center of Algeria, you can be more precise, to the shore of Algeria are, in the last 3 years, suffer only minor problems. I don't say attack, problems in general. Probably, but this is a scenario that we studied with my people, there is an agreement. Freedom of transit in direction of Libya through the desert and no problem on the line. Because now I speak as soldier. A pipeline of 1,000 kilometers means to have a soldier every 50 meters. Okay? But a soldier is not enough. We need 2 soldiers every 50 meters. And they can keep a guard every 4 hours, 6 hours in the desert. Then they have to be changed. But it's enough to have a concentration in the desert of 50 people, and you cannot react, and you can destroy the pipeline. I speak of, if some of you was a soldier knows what I mean. By night in the desert, 50 people can defeat 10 soldiers in 10 kilometers. Okay? So if nothing happened in the area, it's not because there is a control of the state of Algeria. Because there is an agreement. Because any moment, Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda can create a main problem. If you remember well,
let's just understand this properly. There's an agreement between...
No, you told me.
No,
I cannot say because the Algerian ambassador came in my office.
The Algerian state is direct between...
Probably something is happening. If you remember, I can make the name because now he's retired. If you remember, 4 years ago, it's called when there was attack to Algerian pump system with gas in the south. 3 or 4 years ago. 3 years ago.
Yeah,
3 years ago.
2013.
2030, yes. 3 years ago, probably you remember, there was an attack of a gas station in the south. And what was the reaction of the chief of defense of Algeria? No discussion with the terrorists. No problem for the kidnapped people. We disregard completely. And also 2 Italians passed away, Spanish, a couple of Brits, technicians that were there. You know? So they officially, in case of attack, they don't have any agreement. No discussion. Because this is important for the Algerian. And this is important also for Europe, because Algeria is one of the main producers, and they pump a lot of gas in the market, especially through Italy and Spain. For this is very important. Stability of Algeria is very important. And if you speak with an ambassador of Algeria, they will tell always you that there is stability in their country. And in fact, the so-called Arab Spring has not created a lot of problems in Algeria. No change. The main problem are in Tunisia. But look, Tunisia has no gas. But okay, now we open a box of Pandora, because if you start to speak of what is happening in the south of the Mediterranean, is a long discussion. If you have some question, we can speak outside. But this is very important. During a meeting in Rome 2 weeks ago, was very clear the position of the Algerian ambassador and the Tunisian ambassador in Rome. Not in Rome, but were in this conference. Both the government refuse absolutely that you give, that in the Arabic world is given the rank of no-state actor to Daesh. This is very important, because if you admit they have a rank, because also to be a no-state actor is a rank for them, you know, is reaches a level of importance, you know. You are a no-state actor, you are something more than terrorist. They don't want to have any, because if you have to deal with no-state actor, they cannot act as they have to deal with terrorists. So, Algeria, if I have to put €1, I put that in the next 5 years, no problem in Algeria. €1, no more. Okay?
It's all right, you put a lot already at stake here. Thank you very much. Let me move now to the audience. We have 15 minutes left, and I'll take a couple of rounds of questions. We'll start there, please, and then I'll come back to you, Dr. Zakaria. please.
Hello. Yeah. Good evening. My name is Utkarsh Kulshresht. I am an ex-seafarer, a ship's master, and used to trade these areas we spoke about on tankers, gas, and oil both. As the discussion progressed, we all figured out that really no state actor has much to gain by blockading the Hormuz Strait for any significant point of time. No state actor really is going to benefit from that. As far as non-state actors are concerned, to be able to blockade the Hormuz Strait for any significant time was nigh on impossible. There's quite a bit of military presence in that area. Like we saw in the case of Red Sea piracy problems, all it took was for the 21 nations to put their naval vessels up and down, helping the tankers and other kind of shipping to move, and the problem kind of died a natural death. Well, at least it's comatose now.
Yeah.
So really, the threat perception for Hormuz blockade having any long-term effect, I somehow beg to differ here, that this can significantly affect energy security, especially from the perspective of energy consumers. I mean, if you look at Asian countries, yes, Qatar, certainly the biggest exporter of natural gas, has to ship through the Hormuz Strait, but Australia is coming up, Gorgon field. Australia by 2020 shall have the largest plate capacity of natural gas the world over. Shale gas, like the Colonel pointed out, is a trump card which US has. West Africa is emerging. Mozambique is planning to start by 2020. Let's see how these things happen. I mean, there are other sources of energy. So as it was mentioned earlier in the discussion, that having alternative sources is also a form of security, because you are not able to completely cut off the supply. All this put together, the threat perception looks a little obfuscated. Who shall threaten shipping? Finally, I mean, in nutshell, what we're talking about is protecting shipping from these sea lanes. Then who shall threaten, and what do they have to gain with it, apart from a small, localized or a short-term disruption?
Thank you.
May I know where you come from?
Pardon me?
Where you come from?
I am originally from India.
I was sure of that. No, you know why? Because finally India decide to give freedom to the Italians that were doing their duty in the Gulf.
Let's take a couple of questions and
No,
I'll come back to you, Zakaria.
Thanks for this nice presentation. So you forgot something important. The multinationals, petroleum multinationals, is earning too much. Why don't these multinationals can secure, transition on transportation of gas and petrol? They can hire maybe special forces like black water or something like this. I think intervention of NATO will provoke people in the area. And NATO is more weaker to protect these routes. We remember the defeat of NATO in Afghanistan. Taliban is still there, and after 10 years, they withdraw. There is a very easy solution. You said democratic Turkey will guarantee the pipeline theirs. Also, democratic regime in Egypt will guarantee the safe of Sinai. Why you support Sisi? And he's killing us our people, and he killed Regini. Condolences for Regini, who was assassinated deliberately by Sisi regime. Thank you.
Okay.
Let's take address the question, maybe Robin, the perception of risk, because it's very much, I mean, the way you framed it. There is no risk for the global security ecosystem, if you like, of energy. But in fact, for the producers, it's a huge risk for the Gulf countries. But maybe we'll hear Robin's
view on this?
Well, look, I think it's a very good challenge, and it's precisely for that reason. A lot of people have written papers on how Hormuz could be closed down and what would happen and so on. And deliberately for that reason, I tried to make my paper broader, because I pretty much agree with you. I think it's quite a low probability event, but one with very high consequences. And that's why it's kind of interesting to think about. I agree in kind of normal circumstances, I don't think any of the states around the Gulf would try and close down Hormuz, but in an extreme case, as we had in the Iran-Iraq war, when people are really fighting for survival, it's not impossible, and the consequences would be very damaging. Also, these methods you mentioned for tackling the security things, and the naval patrols off Somalia against piracy and so on, yes, of course, they have been effective, but they do come at a significant cost. And you have to look at, is it cheaper to have these very large naval patrols, or would it be better to invest in alternative routes, or invest in stabilizing Somalia, or any of the other possible solutions? You should got to say, even if there isn't a disruption, it still imposes some kind of a cost on to the states in that region and the multilateral forces. And then there's kind of the lower level disruptions. I mean, even if there isn't a closure of Hormuz, there could still be sabotage, there could still be, and there was, of course, a few years ago, there was a bomb attack on a tanker, Japanese tanker coming through Hormuz, which was never really pinned down, not public, I think, anyway, to who was behind it, but a little known terrorist group. That could get more serious. You could particularly imagine in the Red Sea that might get more serious, where you've got various, Yemen in particular, as a base for terrorist activities. Wouldn't shut down the Red Sea, but I mean, it can still be a significant danger to ships, can still cause costs, loss of life, and so on. And your points on the gas, yes, of course, the gas market is getting more diverse, and yes, we've got more supply out of Australia and coming now out of the US and possibly East Africa. Qatar at the moment is about a quarter of the world's LNG capacity, so it is a huge, huge factor in the global LNG market. Now, by the 2020s, it'll be about 20%. So it'll be less important, but it'll still be very important. And losing that would be something that, the Europeans could probably cope with, but it would be disastrous for Japan in particular and for Korea. And you also got to think about then what's the knock-on impact. If you lost supplies from Qatar, the Russians would probably step up and would be willing to supply more to Europe. But there'll be some quid pro quo, and the Russians will have their own things that they would want in return for that. So it's not an ideal. I mean, again, of course there are solutions, but I mean they all come with their own costs and their own implications. But I mean, I thank you for your challenge. I do basically agree with the premise of your point.
Thank you so much. And just
May I sign? Cool.
Yes, I mean the point made by Dr. Zakaria.
Both of them. Just
instead of under the table deals, why?
Okay, under the table. No. Okay, just to tell my friend from India, I'm surprised that an Indian asked a question. No, my friend from India, no, because you don't appear as Indian. You appear more European than Indian. Okay, when NATO was asked to act against piracy in the Gulf, in the Horn of Africa, the ship were there, EU was participating, and now the problem doesn't exist anymore, or is irrelevant, the risks. Only India had the problem with the soldier doing that, but that it was solved. So you are the last to ask this question. So or you can stand up and say, I'm from Malaysia, and you can ask a question, otherwise an Indian is a bad condition to ask it, because the only nation that creates problem is India. But anyway, doesn't matter, my friend.
We can have a discussion about it.
Okay, we can have discussion, separate discussion. Speak of Sisi. First of all, I speak of Sisi. Speak of Sisi. Egypt. I'm a fan of Sisi because he was an infantry officer. We start together, He was infantry colonel as me. Then he had a better career, but doesn't matter. Let's say, this is important that you know that.
I think you should.
Do you know how many inhabitants has Egypt? 90 million. Sisi has to control a nation of 90 million. Wait a moment. the minority in Egypt, the minority in Egypt, and nobody knows, but I have to tell you because you have to make a picture. Before to speak badly of people, you have to know the situation he has to face. The minority in Egypt of the Copts, there are more Copts in Egypt than Greek in all Greece. Just to give you an idea. No, you have to be an idea. So, he has to control a nation where the minority are more than all the Greek. 12 million. So, start to think, I speak of a strategic point of view. You cannot control a nation with some problem inside of 90 million of people. Put out the Copts, 78 million of not Christian, that have a lot of interaction inside, come from the problem of brotherhood, problem or not the problem, call as you like, with the carrots. Remember the stick and the carrots? Sometimes it's needed to use the carrots, but sometimes it's needed to use the stick. And the only way, in my opinion, this is Giuseppe's opinion, to control Egypt now, and it's good for all of us that Egypt is a stable country, because there are more Egyptians in Egypt than all the people in the North Africa together. If you put all the people from Jordan to Mauritania, all the population together are less than Egypt. This is mathematics, my friend. And if you pretend to control a nation of 90 people kindly, in this moment, no chance.
Then you killed Mussolini. Why?
I know, I don't say that, but sometimes this history teach, the history of the last 20 years teach that sometimes it's better to have a strong man than the no control. Historically, probably historical, not me, the European nation or the nation that share the border with Egypt think that it's better to have a strong man at the leadership. Probably you are right that it is not the example of democracy is government, but have a unified, stable country. Probably that to have a chaos in a country not of 4 million of inhabitants as Libya, with 90 million of inhabitants.
Yes.
19 million of inhabitants.
Well, we can continue this discussion over
Okay.
later, because you also don't necessarily like Erdogan, who's also a strong man with a democracy.
Erdogan has the same problem. Because there are more Kurdish in Turkey, the Portuguese in Portugal.
Yes.
No, because mathematics.
I know, but if you follow the same logic, then Europe should be the first to be controlled in that way.
Yes,
because
you're
much more diverse than us. But let me move to another point that Dr. Zakaria mentioned, which I think is very interesting. Why is the private sector not picking the cost of these alternative routes, these multinational companies and so on? They seem to have it relatively easy. Is that right?
Well, look, I think if you think about local security issues, then oil companies deal with that all the time, from Nigeria and Libya and Iraq, and all these situations, and they hire security guards and so on. They work with the local authorities to whatever extent they can, and they use a lot of private security. And that's just a reality of doing business in countries where there's security threats. I think the same with shipping as well. The ships take security measures. I think ship owners have been, this is my impression, I'm not a naval security person, but what I understand, ship owners have been pretty unwilling to put armed guards on ships for all kind of legal and liability reasons. Fortunately, the military response to piracy has been good enough. They hadn't really had to go down that route. But I guess if a situation got really bad and there was no other solution, you'd have armed guards on ships as well, if it was necessary. But if you think about big scale stuff, if you think about multinational companies contributing to having their own military forces and guarding facilities on a big scale and so on, I mean that kind of thing has a bad history. And you will find, I think, if you think about a Shell or an Exxon having its own private army and defending its facilities in a certain place, that is, the companies don't want to do it themselves. Politically, it's a disaster. They are seen then as a foreign occupying force and by the local government. They come under huge pressure from Western NGOs. You know, I mean, if you go back to the 20s and 30s, this happened in Latin America. You know, I think the oil companies have learnt their lesson. That just in the long term, that's just a very dangerous way to go. I mean, they're companies, they're not states, and they shouldn't have their own private armies.
Thank you so much. We'll take 2 more questions, please. And then the gentleman just in front of you as well.
Hi, my name is Rémi Pied from the Gulf Studies Center at Qatar University. My question is maybe more for Robin Mills. In the publication, you go in some length on the interested potential of a GCC pipeline network that actually would lead to the Ras Markaz export terminal in Oman. Could you maybe go over the political obstacle that hamper it and a way maybe to go through it? And in case it's possible, what kind of timeline are we looking at here?
And the gentleman in front of you, please.
Can I ask you both, other than the countries we've discussed so far this evening, are there any particular vulnerabilities where there's a risk of attack on a pipeline or something else which could lead to an unplanned outage which could affect the markets?
Thank you. Robin?
Yeah, just to think about the Ras Markaz facility. This is one proposal. I mean, there have been other proposals, but this maybe applies a bit more generally. I mean, just to give the background, Ras Markaz is near Duqm in southern Oman on the Indian Ocean. There's a large oil storage facility which has recently, I think, been announced that the Omanis will go ahead with constructing it. It'll be linked to their pipeline network, but it could be linked to other GCC pipeline networks. And I think it's public. There have been discussions with the Kuwaitis over this. But I mean, of course, in principle, the UAE could connect quite easily, and the UAE has a border with Oman. Also, Qatar could, but it would have to go through Saudi Arabia. Of course, the Kuwaitis would have to go through Saudi Arabia as well, or they would have to deliver oil by ship to the UAE and then through to Oman. But you know, in principle, that's a possibility. Something similar is using the port of Fujairah in the UAE, which already has this pipeline running from Abu Dhabi through to Fujairah. I mean, again, you could link that pipeline to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, other countries. But I mean, the general idea of having a pipeline network bypassing the Strait of Hormuz, yeah, you know, it is under serious discussion. If you think about the Ras Markaz facility, I think 2016, if they're going ahead, they're talking about completion of the first phase by 2019 or 2020. So, you know, probably 3-4 years if it were to go ahead. I mean, really, the obstacles. Our first obstacle is finance. Who's going to cough up the money for this? One of the regional countries that sees that the risk is serious enough that it wants to have the insurance, or maybe an outside player, maybe China, for example, might want to sponsor, or at least part sponsor that to improve Chinese energy security. The Chinese, of course, constructed the pipeline to Fujairah, although they didn't pay for it, but a Chinese company built it. It's part of Chinese strategy to improve energy connections. So maybe the Chinese would be a party that might be interested, you know, and speculatively maybe others, maybe, you know, India it would be quite useful for, or the interested countries. So it's quite realistic, and I think it's just a question of, you know, okay, there is some political question over this, but generally Oman is generally a, you know, well-regarded and fairly neutral member of the GCC, so that doesn't present, you know, particular problems. I think if you think about pipelines going through Saudi Arabia for other countries, that's a bit more tricky, and so maybe it's more realistic to have a route that goes through the UAE and then Oman and then Kuwait or Qatar or whoever else could just take oil by tanker and drop it off in the UAE and then through. But I think, you know, it's a reasonably realistic proposal. It's primarily probably a question of the financing.
And Giuseppe, what are the areas of potential risk that are particularly vulnerable at the moment that we've not mentioned? Also, Robin, if you can think of something.
No, the area of potential risk in this moment in the globe is the Silk Route. Okay? The Silk Route is very important. And what is happening in the let's go China Sea will affect in the future. Because this is the line of where probably you can tell better than me, all the support, energy support to China has to arrive in China. And the China has to control this, another street. This is an area we never discuss. And another we will see what happened is the Arctic route. Now, because of the reduction of the ice, there is more transit in this area. But it seems that they have found an agreement. But the problem in the Gulf of China is a problem in the future.
Great. Well, thank you so much for both of you. I think it's been absolutely fascinating, and I learned quite a lot about a subject I knew very little about, and I think it's been really an eye-opener. It's clear from what we've heard today that the consumers are doing their business to try and secure the transit and the routes, whether it is above the table, under the table, wherever it is happening. They are looking to the future, and they're making sure that those supplies are continuing. Unfortunately, the suppliers are not necessarily considering this, and particularly in the Gulf, you see there's a vacuum in terms of considering the security of energy production and transit. And maybe there is an opportunity here to start direct contact and some kind of mediation with Iran over a Gulf all-inclusive strategy on how to protect the supplies. With this, I'll bring this to conclusion. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the discussion. We have a light meal offered in the foyer, so please join us. We'll have more time to speak to our speakers. Thank you very much.